Well, welcome everybody to this 11th Humane AI Conversation. I'm Louis Matikos. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Amsterdam, specifically at the Institute for Information Law and also at the Department of Jurisprudence. I'm joined today by Jens Halterlein. I'm sorry, my German hasn't been improved since high school. He is a researcher at the University of Freiburg, and he's going to talk today to us about the AI plan, the AI strategy from Germany, from a variety of different, very interesting philosophical and sociological perspectives. Maybe you want to add to that, Jens?
Well, yeah, thank you for the kind introduction and yeah, for the opportunity to present some of the research I have been doing recently. And yeah, actually the analysis I'm going to present today has been conducted as part of a project that has been funded by is funded by the Fritz Thyssen Foundation, a German research funding foundation, under the title Artificial Intelligence and Civil Security, a study on the effects of the future vision AI made in Germany on applied security research. Well, that's a long title for a project. And today, actually, I will focus on the AI strategy itself and not so much on the effects on applied security research. However, I'm happy to discuss these aspects with you later if you're interested, for sure. Yeah, and if you don't have any preliminary remarks or questions, I would start right away.
Well, maybe just for clarity's sake, we'll start first with your introduction on it.
Yeah.
For the audience, I'm going to say this with your introduction on your topic, and then I'll have some questions that I'm going to give you and have some discussion between us. And then there's also some more than enough time and space also for interaction with other attendees and questions the audience might have for you or for us or both of us. So very excited. Let's get started.
Great. Yeah. I'm going to talk about, I don't know, 15 minutes, more or less. Yeah. And then I think we have enough time for questions. So Germany's AI strategy is part of a larger trend, so to say, because in the past few years, many governments and also supranational organizations published strategy papers and other documents in which they present their visions of the future development, application, and regulation of AI. And nation states in particular articulate the opportunity to shape the future of AI according to their specific political cultures, values, traditions, and national pathways. Which is also important, they portray themselves as participants in a so-called global AI race or race for AI and competing over economic and geopolitical power. If we look at the scholarship on these national AI strategies, we see that most of the studies have approached the subject by conducting comparative assessments, by evaluating from an ethical perspective or based on criteria of competitiveness, and also for sure by providing policy recommendations accordingly. Well, I have followed a different approach, and my engagement with the topic is based on the fact, one could say maybe, that AI strategies not only define policy agendas and determine rules and measures to push ahead or restrict the integration of AI in society, but beyond that, they articulate future visions of these societies based on the promises and fears associated with AI. And in doing so, these strategies connect the appeal of national science and technology endeavors to a certain understanding of the state. And that is a liberal state that provides for the flourishing of the nation's innovative abilities and the economic well-being of its citizens. So a classical liberal understanding of a state. And so hence AI strategies not only articulate certain promises and fears or risks, but simultaneously reimagine and reperform, I would say, liberal statehood in a, one could say, technological society. And in order to unfold this amalgamation of technoscientific promises, technofears, imagined futures, and concepts of statehood, I would like to focus on 3 aspects of the vision of an AI made in Germany. First, the concept of a human-centric AI, which is, I think, particularly interesting for the RPA and the audience. Then secondly, the goal of technological sovereignty. And third, the principle of criticality. So I start with my analysis of the human-centric AI concept. As the normative core of the German AI strategy, I have identified this concept of a human-centric AI. And such an AI would be oriented towards the common good, the well-being and dignity of citizens, as well as the benefit of society at large. And in the AI strategy, these claims are mainly substantiated with numerous technoscientific promises, echoing traditional framings of science and technology as drivers of social progress. You might be all familiar with these claims, such as an economic impact of AI on manufacturing, agriculture, energy, transport, and so on, the protection provided by AI-based IT security, police work, emergency services, pandemic management, the potentials of integrating AI in medical diagnosis and robotic care work, and the use of AI for the efficient consumption of natural resources. And all these alleged benefits in terms of wealth, national security, public health, and sustainability can be seen, I would say, as the essence of the desirable future that a human-centric AI would bring about. However, the strategy also addresses a number of risks and potential harms that are also commonly associated with AI. Particular attention is paid to the widespread fear that the further development of AI-based production systems could either lead to mass unemployment or to the disqualification of work. Furthermore, AI could cause fatal car accidents and enable the manipulation of political opinion through chatbots and deepfakes. Then also with regard to security issues, AI would bear the potential to create cyber crimes or enable cyber crimes and cyber attacks on critical infrastructures. And then also important ethical expert opinions in particular highlight the dangers of using biometric facial recognition and AI-based job recruiting tools because it could violate the constitutionally established principles of equality and non-discrimination. So to sum it up so far, what is claimed to be at stake with the rise of AI are the prosperity, physical integrity, freedom of action, and informational self-determination of citizens, as well as corporate interests and vital system security. Consequently, the concept of a human-centric AI addresses these risks and harms. So the promise is that instead of manipulating consumers and voters, replacing workforce and threatening fundamental rights or even lives, it should be anchored in, I quote now from the strategy, an ethical, legal, cultural, and institutional context which upholds fundamental social values and individual rights and ensures that the technology serves society and individuals. End of quote. And what I'd like to propose now is to understand this particular concept or this particular version of a human-centric AI as a liberal account for the relations between humans and intelligence machines. And from the viewpoint of liberalism, the integration of AI in society may fundamentally alter the condition of freedom, as it could restrict the agency of the liberal subject, unduly influence the laws of the market, and endanger also the liberal state itself. So under the condition of an increasingly digital and algorithmic governing of human actions, it is, one could say, not so much the irresponsible, negligent, or criminal behavior of certain individuals and populations that become a threat to liberal freedoms, but the unintended consequences of using AI or its use for malicious purposes. Hence, the liberal state should not only care about AI because of its economic benefits, but also because the risks of AI endanger the individual rights and civil liberties that are to be protected by the state. So to sum it up, the German AI strategy articulates the concept of a human-centric AI that puts liberal understandings of the common good and the liberal subject at the center of its ethical approach. The second point, technological sovereignty. In many technology fields, Germany has relied and is also still relying on the availability of products and services on a global market. And this is also particularly true with regard to the digital infrastructures needed for AI applications. However, this dependency in the AI sector has been problematized. Actors from all over the spectrum of political discourse recently called for a joint effort to push ahead innovation and capacity building in Germany to the level of technological sovereignty. And the AI strategy in particular legitimizes this goal with the global AI race. Given the market dominance and expensive strategies of big US tech companies on the one hand, and China's endeavor to gain global leadership by means of technology policy on the other hand, technological sovereignty in the AI sector is proclaimed as a way to secure the competitiveness of Germany's economy and also Europe as a whole. And moreover, public trust in and acceptance of a human-centric AI could be seen as a competitive edge for the German economy, since they are seen as a prerequisite for the uptake of AI in society. Consequently, Germany should strive to become a leading global player for the research and development of AI, making AI made in Germany a worldwide acknowledged trademark. And this approach is proclaimed as the so-called third way, as an alternative to the market-oriented way of the US, where private actors play the central role in the innovation of AI, and the state capitalist path of China, where the Socialist Party is the driving force behind the research and development of AI. Beyond this logic of global economic competition, however, I would say that technological sovereignty becomes also a question of avoiding dependency on actors whose approaches to govern the disruptive potentials and to shape the future of AI would differ significantly from the one of Germany. Albeit not explicitly criticizing US big tech companies and the Chinese government, the strategy evokes fearful imaginaries of an AI-powered surveillance capitalism and an AI-powered surveillance state. And against the background of these threat scenarios, it is not only the future wealth of the nation that is claimed to be at stake, but also individual freedoms and fundamental rights. And again, now I propose to understand the way the goal, the political aim of technological sovereignty is legitimized as an act of liberal political rationality. From this viewpoint, the global AI race appears to be a race between a liberal and two illiberal forms of governing. The illiberal forms of governing with AI are characterized by either using the technology for restricting the freedom of citizens or by using it for undermining the freedom of consumers. The liberal form of governing, the third way, has to govern in such a way that these freedoms are protected and a responsible and beneficial use of AI is ensured. Therefore, the dangers of governing with AI, both by private companies and public authorities, are becoming a problem that the liberal state has to address. By articulating a vision that connects the promises of a human-centric AI with the fears of not achieving technological sovereignty in the AI sector, Germany's AI strategy reimagines and reperforms a particular understanding of the exercise of state power. And according to this understanding of liberal statehood, government has to operate between the twin dangers of governing too much, as in the case of autocratic government in China, and not governing enough, as in the case of neoliberal government in the US. So while the dangers of governing too much are associated with the instrumentalization of AI for malicious purposes, this is on the one hand, and on the other hand, the dangers of not governing enough are associated with the failure to regulate AI and to intervene in case of market failure. And only if a balance between governing too much and governing too little is maintained, the vision of an AI made in Germany can become a reality. And this political rationality of liberal government and liberal statehood is enacted by the government's framework for, as they call it, holistic science, technology, and innovation policy, and which brings us to the third point, the principle of criticality. The central reference point of the whole regulatory pillar or the regulation-oriented measures of the framework is the diagnosis of a lack of trust in AI, both on the level of citizens and companies. And this lack of trust presumably leads to a lack of diffusion and inhibits adoption of AI products and services. Therefore, the regulatory measures first and foremost have to ensure that only trustworthy AI applications are developed and brought onto the market. At the same time, however, the framework should not unduly constrain or hinder technological development or otherwise disproportionately increase the cost of placing AI solutions on the market. And to guarantee this proportionality, the framework sets out a risk-based approach. And this approach differentiates AI applications according to their criticality. An increasing risk potential should go hand in hand with increasing control requirements and increasing authority of the regulatory instruments. And while there are ongoing discussions whether 3 or 4 or 5 levels of criticality will provide enough flexibility, there's a consensus that mandatory legal requirements should only apply to those AI applications classified as high risks. In these cases, a conformity assessment and certification process is necessary before an AI application can be put on the market. For low or minimal risk applications, on the other hand, only voluntary codes of conduct are envisioned. A corresponding legislative initiative on the German level is still pending and will surely have to be based on the regulation currently being developed on the European level, which also follows a risk-based approach. And therefore, I think it might be instructive to have a very quick look at the EU's regulatory approach. According to the so-called AI Act proposal of the European Commission, certain AI practices should be prohibited because they are seen as contravening union values. For instance, if they are used to manipulate persons through subliminal techniques, or for general social scoring, or for biometric surveillance of public spaces. For the latter, however, certain types of criminal investigations where the public interest outweighs the risks are defined as exceptions. In terms of addressing the high risks of AI, the EU's regulatory approach perfectly suits Germany's global ambitions. On the one hand, it implicitly addresses the criticisms of China's notorious social scoring system and invasive sales strategies of big US tech companies by classifying these practices as unacceptable. On the other hand, it defines exceptions from legal constraints in such a way that leveraging AI for civil security, for example, will still be possible, and the technoscientific promises of a human-centric AI can still be articulated. Which brings me to my final remark. Again, I would propose that we should understand the principle of criticality as a liberal instrument to navigate between the twin dangers of governing too much and thereby constraining innovation, and not governing enough, thereby failing to address the lack of trust and in AI and hampering its uptake in society. Thank you for your patience, and yeah, well, now I'm happy to answer your questions.
Well, it was a very fascinating talk, and I think that you had a very thorough analysis. You made a very thorough analysis of the AI strategy in a manner that I find quite lacking in most other academic articles or academic pieces on this, as most academic pieces will directly talk about the direct effects of such AI strategies. This law enables us to do this, or this AI is now possible to be used or not. While we should also look at the more discursive level, which you are doing right now. What is the discursive elements? And this also brings me to one of my first questions. You've already touched upon this in your first point, but as I understand it, you're very interested in the epistemological views that are present in such AI strategies. Germany and the German government is clearly articulating a certain view of AI, a certain view of society, or how society should be. And you already mentioned that that view is a liberal one in nature. But something more interesting in that regard also might be, is this the neutral view of AI? Can we say this is the neutral way of looking at it? Or is this also one normative standpoint to look at AI, how we should regulate it, a normative view of it? And if so, does the German government actually see this as a political point of view, or do they see it as a normative, a objective given? This is clearly the way we should handle with this, because if they do, this would actually hinder discourse in this regard. It would hinder further opposite points, political standpoints that are opposed to this liberal narrative. Maybe some more communal narratives might also be very important in this regard.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I think that besides the, one could say, liberal worldview, or I would say liberal political rationality, which I have tried to show that affects the whole structure of the strategy, there's also certainly something one might call technological determinism at work, in the sense that it is treated as a mere fact that the technological change driven by AI can neither be stopped nor ignored. And then there's also something one might call, or which has been called in different contexts, a technological solutionism. So that means AI is basically appraised as a panacea for all social grand challenges, one would say, in the European context. And even the risks of AI could be addressed by means of innovation, which is really important. It's totally innovation oriented, the whole strategy. And this is also the promise of what is called ethics by design, which is a fourth very important aspect of the whole strategy. I wasn't talking about it because it would have been taking too much time, but the ethics by design principle is also a central feature of the human-centric AI concept in the strategy. And it means that risk management through the implementation of ethical and legal principles is done from the beginning of the design process. So it's a technical solution to ethical problems, basically. And I think besides the liberal rationality, there's technological determinism and there's technological solutionism. And maybe together with a general, which is not particular, well, a thing with the AI strategy, but there's also something, there's the whole global economic competition thinking and the fear of being left behind as a nation. And this, together with the two other aspects I just mentioned, legitimizes something like maybe, well, it's a classical, there's no alternative thinking. Yeah. So, and I think this kind of thinking doesn't go well with democratic discourse, at least on more fundamental questions around AI. But I think it's also important to consider that that liberalism also enables, at least that's the claim, that it enables democratic discourse, because it sets clear boundaries to state power, and the state has to respect and protect the rights and the liberties of its citizens. And this is interestingly also the reason why in the AI strategy, the state not only claims to regulate risks, but also highlights ideas about participatory technology assessment and also other forms of democratic deliberation. So these are things that are also mentioned in the AI strategy, and it's also claimed that they will be part of the whole process. However, it's another question whether these claims and procedures are actually realized, and I'm a little bit doubtful there, to be honest. Yeah.
And even if they are realized, can we deconstruct them? Can we criticize them if we all have this one view of a society based on objective human centrism or objective AI regulation? I think Dan McQuillan, a very good academic in this field, had a wonderful term for this called algorithmic totalitarianism, in which we can only view algorithmic regulation through a certain lens. And more often than not, if we want to criticize an algorithm, specifically one algorithm, for example, we have to talk within a certain architecture. I can only criticize one algorithm if I have a different algorithm to criticize it with, for example. And the same counts as well with this, with the points you make and the analysis you give, is that we have various standpoints: technical solutionism, technological sovereignty, which are presented in this very objective manner. But this is why we really need academics like you and events like these to start criticizing those concepts, to open up discourse to other viewpoints as well. And one thing I found very interesting about what you talked just previously before was your economic viewpoint, that this is also very much tied into economic interests. And I think as well, I mean, you already touched upon this. One of my second question is about: do you think that these goals, these state goals, these normative standpoints, these values, these societies that are imagined, do you think that by describing these things as a economic necessity, we are cutting off any discourse on alternative viewpoints? If Germany says we can only survive as a country between this huge war, this AI war, if we do this, if we implement them, if we allow it to flourish, do you think that that's actually a bit facetious, even possibly?
Well, the interesting thing is that if you would only have the argument or the legitimatory strategy of pointing to a global economic competition and the possible dangers of losing or falling back as a nation, I think there would still be room for deliberation on what should be more important. Yeah. But the very interesting thing about at least the German AI strategy, and I think this is also true for the European AI strategy, is that these economic arguments are also tied to normative arguments, in the way that it is not only about losing against the US or China, but it's also about losing against a competitor that has very different normative understandings of AI. and of its benefits and of its risks. So, and this is why I said there's even not explicitly criticizing the US big tech companies and the Chinese state. There's also something like evocations of the surveillance capitalism and the surveillance state, which gives the whole situation that is presented in the strategy a kind of existential danger.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and this makes it complicated, I think, to argument against it. Yeah, so I mean, who would like to live in a surveillance state or under a surveillance state, and who would like to be confronted with a kind of surveillance capitalism as we know it from the descriptions or the analysis of academic scholars who are analyzing our current development of algorithms and their use for capitalist purposes, right? So this makes the whole thing more complicated, I would say.
It's the same I see in many other articles when I talk about ethics by design or human-centric AI. I've never heard someone say, I actually want an unethical AI. I want to make an evil AI. Or I want an AI that completely ignores every single person. Nobody does that. But saying human-centric AI or ethics by design, that still doesn't say anything if you don't clarify what is ethical, which person am I talking about, in what way am I talking about the person. But it's very funny. You also mentioned previously that almost like a branding strategy, even a bit cynical, but very good point. An AI made in Germany. Do you see that as a possibly like a branding strategy, a marketing campaign of using ethics as this selling point, even?
It definitely is, I think.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say it is only that, because it is also much more, depending on the context where you are. But it is definitely also a branding strategy and an attempt to create a unique selling position, yeah, for German AI products and AI services, I would say. And this is not only something that you have to analyze and to bring up from the background of the strategy. This is something that is very obvious on certain levels. There's a lot of discussions about how certification and standardization processes should look like, how they should proceed. And then there are ideas about something like a DIN norm. You know, the DIN is in Germany, it's a very important institution which regulates, for example, the size of papers, so that all papers have the same size. And then there's also the idea that the DIN Institute could also standardize and certify certain AI products and services. And then there's the idea that there could be an ethical certificate, which is, for me, it's obvious that this is, as I said, it's not entirely, but at least partially an economic strategy.
But then in turn, it's also partly a form of control. I know that you are very interested in Michel Foucault and his works on power and power structures and control. And I was wondering if you would see these measures of changing the discourse, changing what ethics means, changing what human-centric discourse is modulated to be controlled to a certain way. So the government isn't saying directly, this is right. They're just defining certain key terms, indirectly specifying what is moral, what is ethics, what is human-centric, and thereby controlling discourse, again, though indirectly.
Yeah, I think it's always important to look at the different rationalities that are behind these governmental actions, strategies. And as I have said already a couple of times, there's in this case I see clearly a classical liberal rationality at work, which means, for instance, that that there's a kind of market principle that is seen as something, well, natural, and it by no way the measures that are taken to regulate risk and so on should interfere with these market principles. So the idea is always that there's a circulation of, for example, I mean, products or data, yeah, and one might try to somehow control this circulation, but one should not completely interrupt the circulation, because this would have tremendous effects. Yeah, and also with regard to the what Foucault calls the conduct of conduct, so the governing of individual free behaviors. One should, if possible, not totally restrict behaviors, but one should, for example, try to guide behaviors in a certain way that the freedom is exercised in a rational, responsible way, for example. Yeah, and this is what you can also see here when the government tries to regulate AI. It's not about prohibiting the use of AI or strongly regulating, but to create a framework that somehow enables, or maybe nudges, one could say, a responsible way of using AI.
So again, yes, a form of nudging, like very interesting. To round off, one last question I had, more from a legal perspective, because I am a lawyer, and to circle back again to your second point on technological sovereignty, and again also relating back to an AI made in Germany, the branding, marketing strategy of ethics. We of course have now within the privacy law domain a bit of a crisis, as data flows to the US and many other countries are restricted because privacy laws in those countries aren't too high enough standard. But one could view that from a point of view of ethics, like it's unethical to expose European citizens to that kind of privacy risk in the US by allowing personal data to flow to the US in that way. But in another way, many machine learning AI depend on personal data. And this measure is also, perhaps from an economic point of view, a form of neo-mercantilism. And again, a way to protect Germany's and the European Union's position in the machine learning field. Would you agree with that?
Oh, that's an interesting point. I think in principle I would agree with that, but I think on the other hand, one has to be careful with the term sovereignty here, because at least in the context of the AI strategy, and I think this can be generalized to other areas of innovation policy and adjacent fields, that sovereignty is not meant to re-strengthen economic protectionism or mercantilism, as you named it, or to achieve something like national autarky or so. But I think it's meant to secure the competitiveness of Germany's economy. So again, one has to understand it as a form of liberal conduct or governing, I think. Yeah. So the guiding question is something like, how can we regulate circulation of data in this case in a way that does not interrupt circulation of data per se? Or maybe to put it in another way, how can we maximize the positive elements of data flows while minimizing what is risky about these flows? So this is the economic rationale behind it, which Foucault calls the security dispositive of regulating risks.
So again, a bit of a in-between between complete economic neoliberal freedom and complete state capitalist control. Exactly,
and this is what I think is the essence of the idea of a third way, because at least in the claims or the self-understandings of the German AI strategy, it is different from the neoliberal way of governing AI that, well, at least it is claimed to be the state of the art in the US. And on the other hand, the more authoritarian way of governing AI or governing with AI, as one can see it in China. Yeah.
Very interesting. All very interesting points. I think we've still got 15 minutes left. I think we still have many more things to discuss between us two, but I think we should also enable the audience to ask some questions. I don't know if there's any in the chat, Irina, or?
No, there are not at the moment, but I have a question if the audience doesn't have a question yet. Oh, there is one from Natalie.
Natalie. A central ambition of the European AI strategy is nothing less than spearheading the development of new ambitious global norms. How does the it's not yet finished. Maybe you want to ask your question live, Natalie? I don't know if it's possible, Irina?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, can you hear me? Lovely. Thanks so much for this super interesting conversation, and really good to meet you virtually. I was wondering, I mean, I think you very nicely demonstrate these three regimes and these three different approaches, each continent having its own one. Only as this quote from the European Commission demonstrates, at least at the EU level, the ambitions seem to be more than simply European values-centered AI regulation and make the values themselves an export product. And I was wondering, how does that fit with your three models? So what is your stance about this exportation of European values into the rest of the world and systems with other values? How do you see that? Is that something we should strive for? Are there things to be concerned about this value colonization of other ways of dealing with AI? I would be very curious to learn your views on that.
Well, thank you for this super important and interesting question. I think maybe starting with the aspects of relation between Germany and Europe, I think this is a complicated relation in this field because well, Germany on the one hand tries to develop its own strategy and own standpoint, but on the other hand, for sure, has to see and has to make sure that it doesn't get into conflict with the European strategy. And in the end, then, if the AI Act of the European Commission becomes a law, then the German legal regulation anyway has to make sure that it doesn't interfere or get into conflict with these legal regulations. So this is a complicated field. I think my impression is that since the COVID pandemic, Germany has started to see itself as more as part of the whole European project when it comes to AI strategies. Maybe at least in a stronger way than it has been doing this before. So it's really an interesting question, and I probably will have to look at it, or anyway wanted to have a look at this relation in a bit more detail in the future. And then I think the main aspect of your question: how should we, or how should I, or how do I position myself to these global claims when it comes to norms, development, and creating normative trademarks. I mean, it's complicated. I mean, who would opt, or who would argue against a human-centric AI, right? and who would say, well, I don't want citizens' rights to be protected when it comes to the application of AI. I mean, it's really hard to argue against it. And well, I mean, I think, well, even the Chinese government and the US government or US tech companies wouldn't say something like this. Yeah. So that's basically probably the universal structure of these normative arguments, that you can't really argue against them, at least in public discourse, right? But that doesn't mean that the intentions behind articulating such a strategy or articulating these norms and claims are the same in any case, or are purely motivated by normative thinking. Yeah. And I think in this case, one really has to not only to look at the claims, but also to compare different claims and to compare different expert opinions, ethical expert opinions, for example, on these claims, and also to have a look at the way these claims are translated into concrete actions, for example. Yeah. I mean, it's one thing to say we want to create a human-centric AI that helps to flourish individual interests and is a benefit for the society as a whole. That's one thing. But another thing is, if you have a look at, for example, at the concrete legal regulations, at the projects, for example, the research and development projects that are funded by such a nationwide strategy, at the concrete, for example, measures that are undertaken by the government once it tries to implement the strategy. I think this is far more important than just looking at the claims.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with you that the implementation is the proof of the pudding. That is a fair point. Maybe to make it even more interesting, I mean, we see also that big tech is also promoting their own version of universal global values. So AI seems to be inspiring interesting race to be the global leader in bringing values to the world.
And maybe to add to this can also be problematic from a neo-colonial perspective, as the European Union is such a huge market and therefore also a huge regulatory player. Our values, which we present as being objective, true, holistic, we are defending human rights, democratic rights, etc. As you said, Jens, how can you argue against them? In that arrogance, we might impose those rules on any company, and that company, not out of any sincere motivation, but out of mere laziness of being standardizing, implements those same rules and standardizations in other markets, in less developed countries, or countries that have a less strong economic weight on the international market. And then in that sense, our normative values are being imposed again different people groups. But then this is not just a problem with AI, it's a problem with any normative standpoint or normative view that we find to be abhorrent or wrong in other countries. So European countries might disdain the treatment of homosexuals in certain countries or women in certain countries. But then those countries might say, it's our sovereign right to have different normative viewpoints than you do. And this is a discussion that's still very, I think, very, very touchy, and will become more interesting and more complicated with the rise of a more global technological field. Are there any other, Irina, you also had a question, I think, or if there's any other questions in the chat also, by the way.
Natalie wrote also something on this in the chat, that a different reading could be then that those rules are too abstract, high level, and non-distinctive, and don't really characterize one model and another.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. I mean, if you just look at the notions of, well, I don't know, freedom, economic growth, yeah, that's one thing. Mm-hmm. And I think pretty much all AI strategies that you can identify today are using or are claiming these notions. But if you look at the exact way these vacuums are filled with content, yeah, it's not only about freedom or economic growth, it's about certain versions of freedom, it's about certain versions of economic growth, yeah. And then you enter into a level where you can have different opinions on what freedom should mean and how freedom should be exercised, how it should be regulated, and so on and so forth, yeah. And then it becomes interesting, yeah. And then you enter into a level where I think democratic deliberation, democratic discourse only starts, yeah. Because on the level of just saying, okay, freedom and so on, well, I mean, as I said, who would be against it? Yeah.
Although you could argue that our conception of the liberal state is a liberal conception, a individualistic conception, while other philosophies or worldviews, for example, African Ubuntu philosophy, emphasizes more the communal aspect or the community as a whole and their interests as being the center point for ethics. So even that might even still be problematized. If we say we're going to be against freedom, you can also maybe think, well, Ubuntu philosophers would say it's not about freedom; it's about communities' interests.
Yeah.
Oh, but I'm also seeing that Chris, by the way, has his hand raised for a while.
Yeah, thank you, Jens, so much for such a fascinating talk. For me, as a social scientist, a quantitatively working social scientist, I approach the topic of human-centric AI from quite a different angle, using perceptions, opinions, attitudes of citizens also as one way that may be a helpful way to guide the development and the implementation of AI. When I read the German strategy on AI, you could see, or you could read between the lines that this is important, but in nowhere that I really see that there's an effort that is made to include citizen perceptions. So would you share that sentiment? And also, do you think like it should be more pronounced in developing AI strategies?
Absolutely, I totally agree with you. That was exact the impression I had when analyzing these parts of the strategy, that there's a lot of claims about civic engagement in the whole process of integrating a vast spectrum of stakeholders in the agenda setting process, for example, yeah, in what I also already mentioned in participatory technology assessment. Different things, but if you then try to identify where exactly these things take place, and you leave the document, you leave the strategy, and you start looking in the internet or wherever where you can find these more democratic, more integrative procedures, you're gonna look for a while. So, and for example, what I tried to figure out, because the claim was, when it comes to, or the federal government claimed that in the agenda setting process, for example, a lot of NGOs participated and were invited and were integrated. And then you can find a list of all the stakeholders, all the participants that form part of a certain step in the whole agenda setting process. And I couldn't really find an NGO. I mean, I could find a lot of companies. I could find a lot of think tanks that were not exactly NGOs in a narrow sense, at least. So I don't know whether they were not invited or they were invited, but they didn't came. I don't know. Yeah, but at least the whole talk, or the whole idea of democratic procedures, of citizens engagement, to me more and more appears to be a kind of lip service, right?
You could almost say a bit of ethics washing even. Look, we invited some NGOs, didn't listen to them, but they were present. We gave them some cookies.
I have one last question before that.
Yes.
I also come from a social sciences and humanities background as well. And we studied in university the philosophy of science. And there was this concept mentioned of carceral imaginaries in this kind of AI technology. And what this proposes is that when imagining and designing AI technology and algorithms, even if we have the best intentions, those technologies may still promote the biases that are in society, such as racism, xenophobia, or anything else, because we cannot imagine our societies and our technology without such biases. How do you think that the German strategy addresses this in a critical way so that it does not fall into carceral imaginaries, and also considering that Germany is a leading point of view in Europe and in the European Union?
These normative arguments and ethical principles, for example, explainability of AI, transparency of AI, fairness, that plays a role, and I would say quite a big role in the strategy, or in at least maybe in other documents that more specifically focus on these aspects. So at least there is reflection on these problems. But then again, I'm not really sure how the problems are addressed. There is, for example, one could say the promise that there will be a lot of research on how to create fair algorithms, transparency, explainability in AI. But I really don't have the expression that maybe there is research on these topics. Well, probably there is, but I don't really have the feeling that this gets the attention that it deserves. For example, if you look at research projects that are dealing with security-related applications of AI, where things like fairness, transparency, explainability should be even more important than maybe in other domains where one could say maybe it's not so important. Anyway, in these domains and security-related domains, what I see is that there's some kind of very narrow understanding of the whole problematic. Yeah, and it's definitely not on the level that the academic community has reached already on these topics, because there's a lot of interesting research going on in more in basic research and not so much in applied research. So I think there's a gap in this area, definitely, and I don't really see how this gap is going to be addressed.
Thank you so much for the answer.
I would completely, just to add a small bit to it, I would completely agree. This is something I've also experienced within the academic resources. I find so much is talking about direct explainability, direct transparency, direct discrimination, and almost nothing is written about underlying power structures, underlying values, underlying worldviews, underlying epistemologies. And one thing that I'm trying in my own dissertation is actually to touch upon those underlying systems to fill in that gap in academic view, especially through concepts just such as contestation and justification. So not just asking for how does this AI come to this decision? Why? How does it discriminate? But should it discriminate? Should it? Is it justified? So not explanation, but justification. And if you can get a justification from human interaction, you can start contestation. You can start deconstructing those algorithmic values, start deconstructing those power structures. But Irina, very good question. This is something that is still very much underdeveloped, like Jens said.
Yeah, I had the same feeling, but I'm only on a bachelor's level at the moment, so I do not have as much information as you do. But thank you so much for this conversation. It was lovely to have you.
Yes.
Thank you for having me. It was great for me as well. I really enjoyed it.
Yes, me too. I think it was very insightful and a very good conversation that really needs to be had on this topic.